Hello, friends. Good morning. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. This is Ayya Soma, and this morning we're going to talk about the Dhamma of inaction. But before beginning, we will start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namassami. Hello to all the friends tuning in this morning. Hello to Louisa, Gayatri, Sonia, Manal, Spook, Douglas, and everyone else who's watching hasn't checked in yet. Hello, Tinery. Good to see you. So this morning, I was thinking about actually, I'll put a link of a sutta in the comments. This is the Viranja Sutta, but actually, I would just like to talk about one little verse. So in brief, the sutta essentially talks about a Brahmin that goes up to the Buddha, and he's quite displeased with him, and starts essentially insulting him, and has so many different claims that he brings up to the Buddha, and he quote unquote insults him for being a proclaimer of annihilationism, an abortionist, and a teacher of inaction, and so forth. Like, there's actually a lot of different attributes, and the Buddha is very skillful in actually taking whatever he says and somewhat actually also using a pun and then actually speaking Dhamma, teaching Dhamma to him. But what I would like to talk about this morning is really when he says here, the Brahmin says, Master Gautama is a teacher of inaction. And the Buddha replies, there is, Brahmin, a sense in which you could rightly say that I'm a teacher of inaction. For I teach inaction regarding bodily, verbal, and mental conduct, and the many kinds of unskillful things. In this sense, you could rightly say that I'm a teacher of inaction. But that's not what you're talking about. Beautiful, right? The reason why I wanted to share these verses with you this morning is because I've been thinking about this quite a lot during this Vasa. So this Vasa, the Sangha has been on somewhat retreat. It's not kind of full-on blown retreat with, except for one of the members of the Sangha, except for Ayya Soma, who actually did a month and a half of personal silent retreat. All of us have been in and out of retreat, so with more of an unscheduled time and focus on solitary practice, but also focus on communal practice, right? And it's been very interesting to really look at the mind as we normally do. And sometimes there can be so many afflictions coming up in the mind of going like, I wished I was I was able to be, in a particular way, that I wish I was more, that my mind was in a particular way, or that I could be capable of doing, of achieving certain states, or I could be, in a way other than than the way that currently I'm dealing with, right? So there's also the usual kind of what the Buddha calls the depression, essentially, of the samana, which is the depression of like, why am I not enlightened yet? Right? We see also some monastics throughout the suttas, also the teris or the teras, actually, when they are described in their faces before awakening, some of them actually are a little bit struggling. They're very relatable, right? They're like, oh, wow, I understand. I think I understand this Dhamma, but I actually am not quite there yet. Why am I not awakened? And this can create a lot of depression in the mind sometimes, or also the sense that one needs to constantly achieve something, right? And then we forget to a certain degree the whole purpose of this practice, which is in fact a practice, which is a training. Even in the instructions of the Anapanasati Sutta, for example, the Buddha uses very often, actually most of the part of the sutta, it's all about sikkhati. So it's all about training, right? So that we really need to understand, rather than just doing something, we need to train ourselves to do something, train ourselves to calm ourselves, train ourselves to um, also experience joy, train ourselves to do all sorts of different things. But a lot of the time, actually, what we need to train ourselves to do is actually to stop doing what we are habitually doing. And so we think that we actually need to do something else, but actually what we need to do is to stop doing whatever we are doing. And so this is why these verses of the Buddha that actually are also present in the Vinaya, which we're studying very much here in communally at Empty Cloud Monastery, this Vasa, this sutta, these verses are also present in the Kandakas, right? And it's so very interesting, the teaching of inaction, as we see throughout the precepts, and also in several different suttas. It's the teachings of the Buddha are actually permeated with suggestions or directions of not doing something, right? So that's actually essentially the definition, for example, of right action is the abstinence, from like the restraining ourselves, the abstinence, the not killing, the not stealing, right? The not doing sexual misconduct, right? So it's actually in the negative rather than in, it's not that the Buddha tells us, oh, well, save every single being, or he doesn't speak in terms of like, oh, you must be giving, or you must be, be doing one particular thing. Of course, there's other parts of the suttas where that happens, where that is actually, of course, encouraged and done. But it starts, what I'm trying to point out, it starts with restraining ourselves from doing a particular action. And the restraining of certain particular actions creates room for then the wholesome actions to flourish by themselves. And it's, to a certain degree, almost a passive act, because when we stop killing, for example, we stop harming, then we actually make room for compassion to grow naturally. But if instead we're constantly struggling with our tendencies towards harming, it will be very difficult to have a mind of compassion. There will be just no room there. The soil is not nourished, right? And at the same time, of course, if we are constantly stealing, well, it will be very difficult for us to even get close to a mind of generosity. There will always be, yeah, some grittiness in the mind, some some wanting to hoard for ourselves rather than actually understand the blessing of letting go, the wisdom of letting go. Because actually, generosity is one of the biggest forms, actually, of letting go that we have that are accessible to each one of us. But in order to access that blessing, access that joy that comes from letting go of something and giving it to someone else, then we actually have to restrain ourselves from stealing, from taking, from wanting different things, right? And the same goes with sexual misconduct. Will be very difficult, for us to actually really appreciate if we are, householders, for example. If we're not monastic, if you're not monastics like myself, for us it's very easy, right? We're just celibate, so it's no problem. But when one actually is not celibate, when one is a householder, when someone is a layperson and is involved in all sorts of different relationships with others, but doesn't have an understanding of what sexual misconduct is and doesn't have an understanding of restraining themselves from that, then it will be very difficult for them to actually create the conditions in order to flourish emotionally, to flourish, to have an actual relationship with someone that is based on principles of not harming, to then let go of one's own particular constant. The mind tells us all sorts of crazy things all the time, all sorts of greedy thoughts, all sorts of wants, right? So if we constantly follow each one of them, well, that will create a lot of conditions for harms for many, many beings, and that includes ourselves. But if instead we train ourselves to let go of all of those thoughts, all of those desires that are harmful for ourselves and the other person and in the relationship, then we actually can create conditions for that relationship to flourish, for us to actually really reach more or go more and more towards that type of love without attachment, that type of love that is unconditional. But instead, if we don't, then our love will always be conditional. Our love will always be actually a bit more of a burden. It will be very much tainted by this attachment. And then, of course, we can see it actually with all the precepts. Essentially, fundamentally, that's what it is. So, similarly, like abstaining, restraining ourselves, abstaining from lying, abstaining from saying what is not truth, then that gets us more and more close to the truth, right? And what is the practice of Dharma is to understand the way things are, not go about what we think things are, but rather understanding this is actually the reality of things, right? So we want to get as close as possible to the truth. And by abstaining from lying, abstaining from saying things that are not to be said, then we get close and close to the Dhamma, so to the way that things actually are. And abstaining, obviously, from intoxicating ourselves is obviously creating the opportunities for us to practice more and more mindfulness, to become more and more aware, to become less and less confused. And so we see once again that it's always the phrasing of the precepts is always in terms of inaction. So it's in terms of stopping whatever we're doing. And when in our day we can have lots of different afflictive thoughts showing up in the mind, we can recollect that Dhamma of inaction, recollect that yeah, that essentially that teaching that we don't need to engage with all of these things. We don't really need to, if we have thoughts of jealousy, if we have thoughts of envy, for example, instead of going towards the criticism, the self-criticism, we can actually just abandon them, abandon them. And sometimes it seems easier said than done. But actually, when we really recollect this, there are these beautiful suttas also where the Buddha is talking about himself as being an unenlightened bodhisattva. And he also says, that when he was an unenlightened bodhisattva in the lifetime, right? In the lifetime right before attaining, the lifetime when he attained awakening, but before he attained full awakening, he talks about his mind, and he says, when I was an unenlightened bodhisattva, thoughts of greed, hatred, and delusion would appear in my mind. And we're like, wow, shocking. Really? The Buddha? Even the Buddha? Wow, it's incredible. And then he would say, yeah, that this would happen to me. And I would look at them, look at these thoughts and go, is this beneficial for myself? Is this beneficial for others? Is this beneficial for myself and others? Of course, the answer is always no, because we can see it. But we can actually apply the same essentially instructions that the Buddha used for himself, we can apply them for ourselves, right? Us unenlightened bodhisattvas meaning that we are striving towards awakening. So we're going in the path towards enlightenment. And so we can actually look at these thoughts and go like, is this beneficial? No, not really. Then why would I do that? So then it's just easier to abandon it, to stop engaging with whatever we're engaging. Because whenever we start, self-bashing, actually we are reinforcing our sense of self. We are thinking, I am the person who's envious. I am the person who's jealous. I am the person who is whatever, harmful. I am, right? And that's when these things then actually become bigger and bigger and bigger. But instead, if we actually understand that is vipaka, that is just a result of previous actions that done in the past, then it's not really a big deal. Then we can actually drop it. It's no different. Right now it's raining outside, right? I see it raining and I understand it has nothing, it's not mine. The rain is not mine. Doesn't define me, doesn't belong to me. It's just raining. So there's a clear sense that that's what currently is happening outside, and it's fine. It's not a problem. I don't need to go up and try to remove all the rain that is out there. Right? But rather what one can do is actually not engage in the karma, not engage in the action that then leads to a vipaka result that will be pretty much what we're seeing currently, perhaps in the mind. Okay, and then we see, all these instructions from the Buddha everywhere, like throughout the suttas. In the Sallika Sutta, it's really beautiful because it's one of my favorite suttas where the Buddha talks about all the different stages of awakening, and then actually points out how those are actually, all the stages of, not awakening, all the stages of attainments, there you go, in meditation. And he highlights how these are pleasant abidings, but they're not the true effacement, not the true eradication of the asavas, right? So not the true eradication of all these whether we want to call them taints or influences in the mind. And he says, yeah, instead he has this like big list of like things that are actually like all to a certain degree related on inaction. He's talking about like, if others will be cruel, we will not be cruel, right? So even if we're surrounded by people that actually are perhaps unskillful, doing specific actions, we don't have to engage, we don't have to do the same exact thing. And so others will be cruel, I will not be cruel. Others will kill, I will not kill, right? Others will steal, I will not steal. Others will lie, I will not lie. Others will speak divisively, I will not speak divisively. Others will be negligent, I will not be negligent. Right? Others will be arrogant, I will not be arrogant, and so forth. Like there's actually long lists of just not being something, not doing something. And we can always recollect that, right? We can recollect how a lot of the times we are doing something and actually that takes effort, but instead we can actually, like, cruelty takes effort, ranting takes effort, saying harsh things takes effort, getting angry takes effort. Right? Craving things takes effort. So, whew, and just like lay it down, not engage with it. It's okay. And that then creates just a really happy place for the mind to rest, for the mind to dwell. And then it's so much easier to access the Brahma Viharas, to access this joy, this mudita, right? This kind of happiness, joy, being present there, this metta, this loving kindness for all sentient beings, this love really for all sentient beings, this compassion for all sentient beings, this karuna, and this equanimity, understanding. When we understand more the way that things work both in our minds and the minds of others, and the reality, the samsara basically, then it's the mind stops fighting and it becomes more balanced, more in tune with things the way they are, right? We go back to the safety of these brahmaviharas that can help us then in the practice. Okay, so these are just a few reflections that come up this morning. In the meanwhile, we have a few friends that joined in. Hello to Charlie, Jules, Sud, Salvatore, good to see you, Andy, Miguel, Massimo, Faze, Niranjan, Union, Bhumika Suat. Faze says, why a monk cannot have sex with his own wife once in a while when he's see his family? It should not be misconduct because she's been seen and is his own legal wife. Why? So, well, hopefully a monastic would not have a wife or a husband. So technically, while we can get married, we can get ordained if we are married. It's usually not recommended unless there's a particular circumstance. But let's say that there is that circumstance, and actually in Asia it can be quite relevant since a lot of monastics perhaps even take temporary ordination and so forth, or there's circumstances, there's just more monastics in general. Yeah, why is it sexual misconduct? Well, it's because we take vows. So actually, one of the vows that we take as renunciants is the vow of celibacy. So remembering that actually the Buddhist form, the Buddhist monastic form, is not a clergy form. It's not, despite what we might think or what might be perceived, but that's not the reason why the Buddha created the monastic form. He was not intended on creating, a church. He was not intended on creating a sort of Vatican, but rather the monastic form in Buddhism is simply basically a fast track to awakening, a fast track to the attainment of liberation. But obviously, when we take this form, we're also like very much in relation with lay people, and also we are, of the Buddha, heirs of the legacy of the teachings of the Buddha. And in fact, the Buddha also reminds us to be the heir of his Dhamma, not of his material goods, because these days, especially for male monastics, especially in Asia, there can be a lot of actually material goods that can come, by taking this form. This being said, once again, the purpose is for awakening. The purpose is for the liberation of the mind. And how does the Buddhas tell us that what is suffering in the mind caused from? Suffering is caused by desire. What is the biggest form of desire? Obviously, we are animals, no different than cats, than dogs, than all sorts of different, creatures that we can see. And their biggest instinctive impulse is reproduction. The biggest impulse is sexuality. And so by containing actually our sexuality, by taking these vows of celibacy, then we are actually creating the opportunities for us to look at our minds, to see how this essentially strong desire comes and plays in the mind, and how we can actually find a different way out of suffering that is not the usual sort of way that we go about things, right? Usually, it's kind of like, oh, I am sad, so I would really like chocolate, so then we go and take chocolate, right? And then we're like, whew, okay, that's better. And then suffering comes back again, and like, oh, if only I could, chat with my friends. And then like you chat with your friends, oof, that's a relief from suffering. And then we're back to square one, because the suffering comes back again. And that means that we haven't really found a true escape from suffering. And so the Buddha actually gives us another way out that is not in partaking with sensual pleasures, but it's rather to let go of our desires and be content no matter what, right? An unconditional happiness. And so obviously when it comes to the strong sexual impulses that we have, then it's a really incredible training for the mind to renounce to that, and find new way to be happy, to be content. And then we say appetite comes through eating. We say that in Italy. I like it very much. It's a very good good saying. So yeah, the least, we eat something, the least we crave it. And so the least we have sexual intercourse, the least we're actually interested in sexual intercourse, right? Because there's a difference between repression and actually not engaging, not acting upon it, right? So we're training ourselves not into repressing ourselves, but we're training ourselves in letting go of this desire, letting go of like following all our, cravings. And so that creates like a peacefulness in the mind, tranquility. So it's actually very, very, very lovely. So it doesn't matter who the person is, if we go back to our families and we have a significant other, it's sexual misconduct on many different ways. One, because we're actually betraying, first and foremost, the whole purpose of why we're having this form. So we're betraying ourselves, we're betraying the Buddha, we're betraying the lay people that are supporting us because we are celibate monastic. So if we are saying that we're something, we should be acting in accordance with that, rather than pretending that we're celibate, right? That would be quite dishonest. And then on top of that, obviously, we would be kind of backsliding, right? We would be practicing something that doesn't lead us towards awakening, but rather actually just keeps fueling our defilements. So I hope I answered that question. And Sud says, good to see you, Sud. There is instruction to develop wholesome qualities, but then there is the mind that is not in control since it's not self. How should one approach development of wholesome qualities when things are not in our complete control? Well, so since you're a doctor, you should know this very well, right? So, for example, when you are dealing with the bodies of others, they're not you, right? So they're out of your complete control, right? But you understand how you went to school, right? You have a degree in medicine, you have a lot of experience in the field, so you understand that certain conditions create certain results, right, in the body. So it's the same thing with the mind. We understand that certain conditions create certain effects. So then, no different than with the body, right? If we want the body to be healthy, or if we want for the body to become, um, if we see that there's like a disease in the body and we want the body to remove that disease, then we have to put certain conditions in place, and we will have that result. So it's no different when it comes to the mind. And that's basically what the teachings of the Buddha aim at. They're all instructions that enable us to fundamentally understand cause and consequence. And a lot of the times, they're really counterintuitive, because we think, for example, that accumulation will lead us make us happy. I mean, it's obviously these days it's even more exasperated, but because we're living in, a day of capitalism, or tanhaism, as I like to call it, like literally, a whole system that is based on tanha. So the analysis of, to a certain degree, it's, there's part of the teachings of there's the first noble truth, the second noble truth, but actually there's not the third and the fourth. But actually there's the opposite of the third and the fourth. So people fundamentally are saying there's no end to suffering, and actually, um, here's the way to increase more suffering. And so that can be very, obviously complicated, but back in the day it was no different in the sense of the root. Like, there was always the idea that obviously the mind tends to think that there's accumulation, there will be more happiness. It's just that these days it's just more exasperated. Okay, so Spook says, the teaching, do no harm to self or others. I have found I feel terrible when I do harm self, which affects others, or harm others, which affects me. 10-day retreat helped. Thank you, Spook, for sharing that. Yes, absolutely. Actually, during retreat, it's very helpful actually to go on retreat time, to really spend some time with our minds, and to look at our minds and really see how this kind of thing works. Right? We get acquainted to it, and then we start seeing cause and consequence, and we start also getting in tuned with what you're describing, actually, with this emotional feeling of like, wow, I feel terrible. So actually, sometimes, goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the sometimes counterintuitive teachings. So we think that something makes us happy, but then actually, when we are really looking at the experience, then we're like, actually, this happiness is not really that happy. Actually, it's quite agitating. Actually, it's quite awful. I thought, I harmed perhaps that person, thinking maybe out of righteous indignation, right? And the righteous indignation feels pretty good. But then when we look at it closely, we're like, actually, it feels really bad, and it's harming me and it's harming others. And when we actually get really close to this experiential, emotional understanding of things, dispassion naturally arises in the mind. And because it's entrenched with wisdom, because we're actually seeing things the way they are, and we're like, this is quite ugly. I don't really want to do this. No, no good, no good. And like when something is kind of gross, it's a little bit like if we find, maybe we're eating, delicious soup or something, and then we find some kind of gross stuff there, maybe an insect, right? Maybe there is a cockroach there. We're like, oh, right? We don't want to eat it anymore. And the very beginning, we were enchanted by the flavors, etc. But then there's this passion that comes because we actually see this cockroach or whatever, or this hair or something gross, perhaps in the food. So it's the same with the mind. We're kind of like, oh, actually, this is really gross. This is not as good as I thought it was. And when we can have that experience of this passion, then it's very important to acknowledge it, to see it, and that's actually wisdom, something that we want to keep cultivating. And yeah, retreats help a lot for that, because there's very few distractions along the way. And Hai Ang says, compassion without wisdom is a hindrance to our spiritual development. Do you agree? Yeah, actually, yes. It's what I think Pema Chodron calls idiot compassion. Um, so yeah, sometimes actually we can enable people to make bad karma, and we might be also making bad karma as well. So that's that. Yes, that will be a hindrance to our spiritual development. Typical example of that could be, for example, if there's a drug addict and who's asking us for drugs, and then we're like, okay, yes, I'll give you drugs. So to a certain extent, that could seem like a little bit of a compassionate thing, but actually we're doing something quite harmful. um, and so something that would be a little bit wiser would be to instead help that person find help if they want to find help, like support them in a way that doesn't harm them. And Spook says, I'm not there yet. I have righteous indignation and I mean it. I want them to know the fear and loathing they put people through so they'll stop, but I don't act on it. Well, it's good not to act on it, but I encourage you to really look then at the righteous indignation. Like, what does it feel like with you? And so, usually, righteous indignation in particular comes from something really delicious, is that we're right. So, we need to look at the gratification that comes from anger. The Buddha talks about anger as the honey tip with the poison root. So we need to understand what the honey tip is, and that's the righteousness. And what is the poison root? It's the indignation. So we need to understand that how does that feel within us, and without thinking, oh, I'm not there yet, or blah blah, because actually that's practice. So um, it's a path. So there's time. We shouldn't be in a rush. Right now, our duty is not to repress this, definitely not to act on it, but not to repress it, but actually to look at it for what it is. Whenever we're experiencing, for example, righteous indignation, really paying attention to that poison root and unwrapping it, and then understanding the critical difference between critical thinking and anger. So critical thinking is understanding right from wrong, right? Identifying this is correct, this is right in accordance with Dhamma, this is not right in accordance with Dhamma, and that we want to protect and we want to keep nourishing. But the anger part, that actually is draining. That part is unskillful. That part is actually very harmful for ourselves. It actually prevents, it hinders also the critical thinking. But usually when we're experiencing strong emotions like righteous indignation, usually they're kind of all embedded, like they're kind of like all mixed upon. So we want to actually like open them up, like unwrap them, and nourish what needs to be nourished and toss away what we don't need. So keep nourishing the critical thinking and toss away the indignation. And Dan says, do you think a skillful approach not to be involved when one cannot do something beneficial could, with the help of ego, Mara, and friends, lead to numberless of isolation and Hanhaism? Not sure I understand, because I'm also ESL, so I'm not sure I quite understand your question. Do you think a skillful approach not to be involved when one cannot do something beneficial could lead to numberless numbness or isolation in Tanhaism? Well, I don't think that a skillful approach not to be involved could lead to numbness, but definitely an unskillful approach can lead to numbness and isolation in Tanhaism. So, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to answer specifically this question, because I can't think of like an example. If you want to give me like an actual example, concrete example, then maybe it's easier. it's easier to address it. But usually if something is skillful, so skillful meaning kusala, then it will definitely lead towards something that is beneficial for ourselves and also for others. And Zinfinite says, I currently have a chesty flu. I was wondering what natural remedies the Buddha has taught through the years for this. So this is actually a question for monk chat because usually during the other live streams we kind of try to get the questions to be focused on in particular the subject. And no, the Buddha wasn't really focused too much on on physical remedies. I hope that you're going to get better soon, but I suggest actually Googling traditional Chinese medicine. Spook says, how does it feel stultifying until everything is gone and then it's motivating? A man with nothing has nothing left to lose. Not sure I understand. But yes, a man with nothing has nothing left to lose. Absolutely. Yeah, that's why we leave everything behind as monastics. So you have nothing left to come. Like there can be so many paranoias, for example, people stealing things from us or like this and that. Well, we don't have anything to steal. Or if people come to the monastery and steal, we're kind of like, all right, it doesn't belong to us. It's just there's a bit of a different relationship to something when one is one has left everything behind. And Anagarika Sunya, hello, says, I have regrets of things I didn't do for fear, but feel I should have done. How does this fit with this idea of inaction? Well, I would say that, that is one of the hindrances that can happen, right? Where we have regret coming up in the mind. Well, first of all, if we think that actually there has been an action, so it's important to clarify that if we're actually in a situation where there's a person, for example, drowning, and we don't do anything to help them, even though we are capable of helping them, we are deciding to make an action. So it's a little bit different than just being not active, right? So the Dhamma of inaction that we were talking about, it's more when we are engaging, with something unskillful. So then we can actually stop doing something unskillful. But ideally, there's like a sort of path. Once we stop engaging with what is unskillful, then that will lead us to engage with what is skillful. And so it is difficult to engage with what is skillful if we haven't stopped engaging with what is unskillful. So we can, with what has happened in the past, well, we can't really do much, right, about it. It's happened in the past. What we can do, knowledge if something that we've not done is unskillful. Forgive ourselves, commit ourselves into the Dhamma, and to do better in the future. And just keep going. Forgive ourselves. We can think about also in monasticism, for us, and I think Anagarika, seems like you are in a monastic sort of path, I assume. If you keep going in this direction, and you'll see, like, when we actually break the precepts, which can happen, what the way that we go about it in the teachings of the Buddha is not to bash ourselves, not to go like, oh, I'm such a horrible person. Why did I do this? But rather, instead, we actually, um, go to another monastic. We tell them we've done this infraction of the rule, and the other monastic, acknowledges that and tells us, okay, do you see your offense? And we say yes. Then the monastic says, do you commit to do better in the future? We say yes. And that's it. That's the end. And we don't go back to it anymore, right? So we're pure. We get back to a state of purity. So it's the same, I would say, wherever we are, if we're monastics, if we're lay people, or if we're lay people becoming monastics, or anything, in between the two, to always use that spirit, that sense of going forward, and not to dwell too much in the past, because that's actually doing something. We're dwelling in the past. But acknowledging something unskillful is okay. Dwelling on it, not too much, not identifying with it, and committing to the Dhamma, committing to what is useful and beneficial. Okay, and Spookwater says the middle way is essential, and the Buddha did teach that, right? Awakening isn't easy without emotional and economic support. Okay, monk chat, yes, monk chat, bravo. And Dan says, I was thinking about how maybe the Dhamma could be held unskillfully. For example, maybe you're still writing, so I'll give you a few seconds. And Amaranta says, Ayya, why is the best way to practice mudita meditation? I feel happy of seeing you, and I'm friends. Good to see you as well, Amaranta. Yeah. So, mudita, actually lately, while I was traveling in Italy, it's very easy for me, interestingly enough, to access mudita when going to entering certain particular churches, which is very interesting because that was not my experience before Buddhism. But now with Buddhism, paradoxically, certain Catholic churches that were off the beaten path, where there are still people that are praying, still people that are doing actually a spiritual practice, are the easiest way for me to access mudita. And that's because it's just so beautiful to see, like in Italy, these Catholic ladies, for example, that are they are like very much devout. Their faith is so beautiful. And even though, we share a different faith, I can just rejoice. I'm happy for their happiness. That makes me happy. And it's just very easy also to get in touch with that flavor of the devas that is in the Catholic Church. So I love it. It's actually like, I'm just really happy. It makes me very happy. So anything that whenever we see, it's very easy for the happiness of others. It's very easy, I would say, when I was a lay person, it was very easy for me to access it. For example, when making food for others, and if they liked the food that I was making and they were happy, I was just happy that they were happy. And then just the happiness, whenever we're happy, also being happy that we're happy. So it's always easier to be happy about someone else's happy. That's just happiness that for me really kind of is the easiest way. But for once we kind of become acquainted with that flavor of mudita in the mind, then we can access it directly. We can practice it. So it's a little bit, we need to understand what are the conditions that light the fire fundamentally in the mind, and not the evil fire. I'm saying the actual wholesome fire. What the fire, like the warmth of the Brahma Viharas. So similarly for metta, right? We have different. Some people use images of people that they love or that they care about. Some people use may all beings be happy and peaceful, right? So there's different tricks to access it. So for each one of us, it will be slightly different. So we need to play around a little bit with what kind of ignites that wholesome fire in the mind of like, metta, or mudita, or compassion, right? And like kind of bring it up, and also understand what creates the conditions also for equanimity. So this has to be a practice of learning, of observing the mind and seeing what works, and then fueling and keeping on doing what works. Okay. And then is saying, okay, I was thinking how maybe the Dhamma could be held on skillfully. What was originally skillful, disgust, or non-action manifesting as a sort of depression or isolation later when mara or the ego gets involved. Signs to tell when this may be becoming unskillful. Okay. No. Yeah. It's very important. I think actually from your description, you already can tell the signs of when it's becoming unskillful. So the easiest way really is to always look at the mind and see, is suffering increasing or decreasing? So if it's decreasing, then we can we can understand, we can keep doing what we're doing because it's clearly leading us towards the cessation of suffering. But if suffering is, on the other hand, increasing, then we have to go and reevaluate what we're doing. And so when we're looking at the drawbacks of sensuality, there can be a point where then the mind can slowly go into depression and disgust. And actually, the Buddha gives very specific instructions for that, which is not to point the mind towards the mark of the beautiful in ordinary things, which is basically the opposite of, like, if we have a greedy mind, to do asubha, so to look at the non-beautiful of things. So he says it doesn't give the directions to do the opposite of that, but rather he actually encourages us to develop the Brahma Viharas, develop a mind of loving kindness. Because when the mind actually dwells in divine abidings, then it just doesn't want to go in a sort of infernal place, right? Which is depression or suffering of all sorts. So it's important, as we are developing this passion, as we are developing an understanding of the non-beautiful, understanding of things that are not too exciting, to actually also develop the mind in loving kindness. Okay, so that's all for the questions this morning. Thank you for all your beautiful questions and your lovely passion for the Dhamma. I definitely share it as well. And hopefully I'll see you all very soon. And may you be all well, peaceful, and happy. And may all good things come to you. And we can end the morning with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.